the way my evil mind works, I immediately wanted to do it. My idea was then to tell her, okay, if it's not needed, I take it back, the apology, no? No, it would have been impolite. On the other hand, if she were to say, oh, finally you did apologize, yeah, you were nasty, you should apologize, it would also not be correct. You get it, how something which logically, if you analyze it, it's meaningless. I offer something, I get it back as unnecessary. But in this very paradoxical way, as superfluous, it's necessary. That's a symbolic gesture at its purest. This is what habits are about. But habits can be more complicated. The true mystery of habits is that it's not only that something is prohibited, but that prohibition itself is prohibited, in the sense that it's prohibited to, how should I put it, to announce it publicly. I read the description of this scene in some book on Stalinism. It's a wonderful, simple example. Imagine a dream for me. We are now in Moscow, 36, 37, Central Committee, okay, I am Stalin. I give a speech. Then one of you stands up and criticizes me, attacks me. Okay, everybody knows that. The next day the question would be, who saw that guy the last? Okay, but then imagine that another guy would stand up and attack the first guy who attacked me, Stalin, and would say, are you crazy? We don't attack Comrade Stalin in Soviet Union. Why are you doing this? I claim that this second guy would disappear even faster than the first guy. That is to say, it wasn't only prohibited to criticize Stalin, it was even more prohibited to publicly announce this prohibition. This is the level at which customs function. And it's interesting to me more and more the way all these functions, namely this implicit, let's call it the implicit obscene underside of prohibitions which one shouldn't announce, of transgressions which remain implicit. For example, a very touchy example, problematic, the Catholic Church pedophilia. I claim it's definitely this kind of inherent transgression of the Catholic Church. You cannot say the way the Church is saying, okay, priests are humans like everybody else, of course some of them are pedophiliac, we cannot control it and so on. No, I even know some examples from a journalist who did research in my own country, in Slovenia, that of priests who, when they joined church, were, how should I put it, straight heterosexuals. This was the institution itself which made them pedophiliacs. So this is something, this is what interests me, how institutions have this kind of a secret collective unconscious, not in the Jungian sense, but in the sense of an implicit symbolic structure, which is publicly disavowed, but nonetheless a disavowed constituent of their identity, which is why typically the Church reacts to these cases in this ultra-protective way. Okay, so, and I think that these implicit rules, these unwritten, prohibited habits which control us, but they are prohibited to mention publicly, this is where change is the most difficult. For example, from my experience of the army, when I served in 75, 76 in the Yugoslav army, this was my basic experience there. How, on the one hand, explicitly, the military community was extremely homophobic. If somebody was discovered to be homosexual, he was beaten every night, totally ignored, and so on and so on. But that's only one side of the story. The other side of the story is that unbelievable to what extent the entire army life was penetrated with homosexual innuendos. Like, for example, even to say hello in the morning, we didn't say hello. We say, I'll smoke yours, or something like this. Like, it was unbelievable. How, this is what interested me. How, again, the explicit prohibition was sustained by a kind of a permanent reference to some kind of a thwarted implicit homosexuality. The difficult thing is to change things here. That is to say, to change things at the level of what Lacan called the big other. And now I'm coming, if you allow me, you're my superego, Irena, a little bit more. The problem is the big other. That's the tragedy today. We conservatives are telling us we live in a godless era, blah, blah, blah. No, I think, if anything, we believe more than ever, but we objectivize onto habits, onto the big other, our beliefs. What do I mean by this? What is the Lacanian big other? Of course, the most obvious figure of the big other is the big other in the sense of God, the guarantee of meaning, some big symbolic institution. Here, so that I will not say only bad things about Christianity, here I think precisely every leftist materialist should fully appreciate the what in bombastic terms we call Judeo-Christian legacy, whose message, I think, is precisely, basically, there is no big other. In what sense do I mean this? I think the text, the first criticism of ideology, okay, is the book of, how do you call it, the guy who was screwed up by God? Job, the book of Job. What's so interesting? Why is this the first criticism of ideology? Remember what happens. Things look really bad for Job. He loses his wife, his goats, whatever, everything. And what happens then? Okay, it's a traumatic situation, loss. Then, do you remember, I think there are 3 or 4, 3 theological friends came, each of them explaining, trying to convince Job that his suffering, his misfortunes have a deeper meaning. That's the point. It's not so much that he is guilty. That's only the first theological friend says. God is just, so if you are suffering, even if you don't know what, you must have done something. Then others give more refined accounts, like maybe God is testing you, but the message is clear. You must have, this has a meaning. It's not just a contingent misfortune. And then comes the beauty. When at the end, you remember, God comes, his message is no. All that the 3 theological friend says is lie, everything that you said is true. That is to say, God's answer is unbelievable. It's truly, as my favorite theologist, Gilbert Keith Chesterton, said, God there becomes for a moment a blasphemer and an atheist. God's defense is not, no, it looks to you that it's a meaningless catastrophe, but it has a deeper meaning. No, God, when God then goes into this crazy rhetorics of, but what about, did you see how the sun rises? Did you see how when it rains, it can rain on a desert where nobody needs it, and so on? God's message is, you are nothing special. The whole universe is crazy like this. It's as if God concedes that his own creation is somehow meaningless, doesn't have a cover in meaning. Which is why I think we should effectively read Job as prefiguring Christ. Because I think, to be brutal and to read the Bible, now I'm giving you a very condensed version of a longer theological argument, what dies on the cross is precisely this God which is the guarantee of a deeper meaning. Here I think Christianity has still a very radical message. What do I mean by this? You know that disgusting, for me at least, metaphor of evil as a stain. Like, if you look at a picture, if you look too close at the picture, you see only the stain. But if you look from a proper distance, you see how what appeared to you as a stain is effectively just an element which contributes to the global harmony. So the idea is what to our finite perspective appears as a stain, evil, really from the omnipotent, all-seeing divine gaze, for that gaze is part of a global harmony. Of course, now the problem is, can we really then say Holocaust, Gulag, or not just the usual suspects, for example, and this always shocks me. Here you can see the falsity of all this humanitarianism and so on. My God, everybody knows what is going on now. According to Time magazine cover story last summer, in the last 10 years, at least 5 million people died unnatural death in Congo. But they are not in, so nobody cares. So, okay, Congo, Holocaust, Gulag, and so on. Are we ready to say, no, this appears only in our perspective because of our over-proximity as a stain, but really it contributes to global meaning, beauty of the universe, and so on? I think that Christ marks the moment when you no longer can say this. The death of Christ means precisely the death of that God up there, which guarantees meaning. Because what comes after Christ is the Holy Spirit. And the Holy Spirit is simply the community of believers. The meaning of the death of Christ for me is, there is no big other, I throw myself into the universe, it's up to you. As every deep theologist knows, the message of Christ is not trust God, but God trusts you. It's up to you, up to your freedom.